Hi, my name is Kel and I'm a therapist and educator with a special interest in eating disorders. Come on in, take a seat, and if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe for bite-sized content across the mental health and eating disorder spectrum. In today's video, I want to attempt to discuss the question, are eating disorders a choice? Now, some of you hearing that or seeing the title of this video will be yelling at your screen saying, of course people don't choose to have an eating disorder. And if you already feel like you're educated on this topic, then feel free, go ahead, click out of the video, go and watch a different video that I've already created. However, I am still hearing on a regular basis from individuals that this belief, this misconception is very much still considered to be true by some individuals. And that is heard in the form of people saying to those affected by an eating disorder statements such as, why won't you just eat? Or why won't you just stop eating so much? This statement, this question, is literally implying that the person engaging in the eating disorder behaviours is willfully, actively choosing to engage in these behaviours. And I hear those questions and those statements frequently enough to recognise that actually this idea really is still a problem. And so it's worth me taking some time right now with you to address this topic. So let's try and unpack it a little bit. Let's think about illnesses. Let's take eating disorders out of the equation for a moment and let's just think about illnesses. Everybody watching this video will have at some point had an illness, whether it was a cold or the flu or COVID as a virus, or maybe an infection. And the experience you may very well have had is that you start to feel unwell, and within the next 12, 24, 36 hours, the symptoms of the condition that you've got become more prominent, more pronounced, until you realise that you've got a cold or the flu or a virus or whatever it might be, and perhaps you get a diagnosis from a medical professional. And I would be able to see some components of the illness that you're experiencing. So for example, I might be able to see you coughing or sneezing, or I might hear you talk about having a headache or aching, those types of things. Okay, so if I asked you, why are you choosing to have a cold, or why are you choosing to be achy and sneeze, you would obviously look at me pretty confused and say, obviously I'm not choosing to do that. I've got a virus, I've got the flu, I've got a cold, whatever it might be. Okay, so let's now try and transfer that in relation to an eating disorder. An eating disorder is a mental health condition, which means that the primary place that exists is within the brain of the individual. So if you think about something like a respiratory infection, that exists in your respiratory system, in your breathing system. But an eating disorder exists in the person's mind, in their mental health, in their brain. And some of the early symptoms that a person might be experiencing as they start to develop an eating disorder is a very critical internal voice that's very negative about them or about their body or about the way that they behave. It might be that it starts to speak very critically or very rigidly about relationship with food, for example. The person might also start to feel increased anxiety and decreased mood, and they might start to shut down and feel more internal, withdrawn from the world. And those are those early signs, similar to the aches and pains that you might start to feel at the start of a virus. And at that point, the eating disorder is already starting to take hold, but the chances are that the person isn't aware that that's happening. It's beyond their awareness. And as the weeks and months progress, those internal experiences will start to be visible, just like the coughing and the sneezing with the virus, because the person will start outwardly showing things such as changes in relation to their behaviours with food, or verbalizing things about how they think about themselves or how they feel about their body. You might see them over-exercising or using other mechanisms for controlling the way that their body looks. And those are those outward signs of the condition. Now, when a person comes along and says, why can't you just stop doing that? Why can't you eat more, eat less, stop exercising, whatever it might be? what they're responding to is only the outward sign of the illness. It's equivalent to saying, why won't you just stop sneezing, to somebody with a cold? Because the illness isn't the behavior. The illness is what's going on inside the person's brain. And they will have in no way chosen that. It literally was something that gradually developed in their thoughts beyond their awareness. Now, you might say, if you really want to push this thought, you might say, why can't they just choose to stop doing it now that they are becoming aware? But if you imagine that this is very much a driven, negative, overwhelming, compulsive kind of feeling to engage in these eating disorder behaviours, which may also be wrapped up in those thoughts with a structure of ideas and beliefs that have crept in gradually that reinforces the need to engage in those behaviours. And those statements might not seem like they make very much sense when they're said out loud. So if a person who is obviously already underweight says that they need to be thinner, in a rational mind you might look at them and think, well, that's obviously not the case, but this person is experiencing an illness that's based in their brain, and they can't perceive what you can perceive, and they can't control what it is that's happened in their brain, just in the same way as you couldn't force yourself to stop coughing and sneezing and for the germs to have miraculously vanished from your body. And I think that this way of thinking about it, kind of contrasting it to a physical illness in that way, sounds a bit far-fetched, but also carries some solid truth to it. In fact, researchers say that about 70% of the etiology of the causation of eating disorders is genetic. So just how you might have a predisposition to particular health conditions, such as perhaps asthma, or I have predisposition to being short, my parent and my grandparent were both short. I didn't get to choose whether or not I was short like them, it's just a thing that happened. Evidence shows that that's also true of individuals, or a good proportion of individuals who experience eating disorders, that they had this genetic predisposition that made them more likely to go on to experience something in the future. And so we can actually say that if you have a direct first degree relative with an eating disorder, you are also significantly more likely to develop an eating disorder yourself. And yes, there's 30% there that we're talking about environmental, but in most instances it is a combination of the both, and nowhere in that 100% is there any space to state that an individual is choosing to engage in their eating disorder. I want to add here though that sometimes people who are experiencing eating disorders can say statements which make it sound like they did choose their eating disorder, that they can go back in time in their thoughts and remember thinking, I want an eating disorder. That thought in and of itself is already indication that an eating disorder is developing, that an eating disorder is in fact present, because it doesn't make any sense to want an eating disorder. Whatever that reason is for the person having that thought is already indication that their mental health is struggling, that their needs are not being met, and that they're trying to grasp at coping mechanisms as a way to regulate their feelings and their coping. And if a person says that statement, as far as I'm concerned, the eating disorder is already present at that point. It has already happened, but those most visible and obvious outward signs of the eating disorder might not yet be totally apparent. So we're only talking about the psychological component at that point. And this is where part of this problem comes from, this idea that we diagnose conditions based on being able to see the outward symptoms, being able to see the behaviours. And we don't, at least as yet, have any way based on scans or blood tests or whatever it might be to determine whether somebody has an eating disorder or another mental health condition, in the same way we would if you had, for example, an infection in your body. There is actually a huge amount of research going on. I'll put some links about that in the description box below in relation to the genetic component of eating disorders. And my understanding would be that researchers are looking at potentially ways to determine if somebody is predisposed to an eating disorder, and perhaps putting interventions in even before the disorder fully develops based upon that knowledge as a potential at least. And this statement that gets used is that genetics loads the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. So that means that a person could be predisposed, but that for whatever reason there might not be a triggering factor in their life that leads to that eating disorder becoming an actual thing that the person experiences. So for example, you could have a predisposition to a physical illness, couldn't you? For example, maybe even just something as simple as asthma, and that doesn't mean that for sure you will develop it. That might be based on some other factors as well. And we are, not me personally, but within the field, we are working to make more sense of that. And all of that research is to some degree driven by wanting to make sense of how a person gets to this point that they're experiencing an eating disorder, and how we can help people who aren't experiencing eating disorders make sense of what that is and how that happens, and to some degree how that is not a choice. We can unintentionally accidentally perpetuate this belief that eating disorders are a choice, because I sometimes hear the term choose recovery. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if I didn't even have something on my notice board here behind me that says choose recovery. And that said, meaning that a person has to choose to work with the treatment available to them, and has to engage with a meal plan or talking therapy or whatever it might be in order to work towards and recover from their eating disorder. But that would just be the same as, let's say you'd had an accident and you needed to learn to walk again. You're not going to have one physiotherapy appointment and jump out of bed and magically be able to walk again. It's going to take the person who's experienced the injury really working over an extended period of time at learning to walk again. And if they don't choose to engage with learning to walk again, then they're never going to learn to do it. And so exactly the same, the person with an eating disorder does have to choose to work with me or whoever their treatment team is, or whoever their therapist is, in order to take steps towards recovery. But that is in no way intending to mean that it is simply a one-off choice, or that a person can just stop having an eating disorder. That choice is an ongoing, daily, sometimes moment after moment decision that the person has to make to keep putting one foot in front of the other and to keep challenging the struggle that is happening inside their brain. And essentially we're talking about rewiring the brain. The person needs to remap their brain and learn new coping mechanisms to deal with what's happening in the brain that allows for it to become more flexible, allows for the behaviours to become healthier, and allows for that distress over time to reduce and the confidence increase. I hope that by talking about this, you can start to see both some of the complexity, but also the obvious reality that a person doesn't choose to have an illness and a person doesn't choose to have an eating disorder either. I would be really interested to hear if you learned something by listening to today's video, and you can leave a comment in the comment section below, or you're also always welcome to send me an email, and my email address is in the description box below as well. I'm going to leave it here today. I hope you're having a wonderful week. Until next time, be kind, be curious, be yourself.